There is a name spoken with a whisper by American veterans, a name you won't find in most history books. It's the name of a man who flew a plane so fragile it could be downed by a single rifle shot, yet he used it to hold back an entire battalion. For 11 hours, he was the only thing standing between an American patrol and a shallow grave. He wasn't one of theirs, yet he refused to leave them behind. Who was this Australian pilot who earned America's highest honors, only to vanish into the shadows of a tragic fate? Today, we pull back the curtain on the silent legend of Vance Drummond. The jungle of Vietnam was never truly silent, but on this morning in 1965, deep within a sector of the Central Highlands, a United States Army patrol was screaming into their radios, the sound of their voices barely audible over the relentless clack, clack, clack of heavy machine guns and the earth-shaking crump of mortar rounds. They were pinned down in a kill zone, a patch of dense scrub where the green canopy offered no protection against the jagged shards of hot steel raining down from three sides. On the ground, medics struggled to patch up wounded soldiers while hunched in the mud, their hands slick with crimson as they worked under a canopy of flying lead. Every time a soldier tried to raise his head to identify the muzzle flashes hidden in the tree line, a volley of sniper fire would kick up the dirt inches from his face. The radio operator, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and grim determination, shouted the same desperate plea into the handset. "Request immediate air support. We are taking heavy fire. Danger close. I repeat, danger close." Then high above the churning smoke and the emerald roof of the forest, the perspective shifts. The deafening roar of the battlefield fades into the steady, mechanical hum of a single-engine cockpit. Here the air is cooler, and the chaos below is translated into frantic bursts of static and urgent coordinates through a headset. Inside the cramped cabin of a Cessna 01 Bird Dog, a man sits with a calmness that seems almost supernatural given the carnage beneath his wings. He is not wearing the patches of the United States Air Force. Instead, the small kangaroo on his uniform identifies him as a member of the Royal Australian Air Force, RAAF. This is Squadron Leader Vance Drummond. With a grease pencil in one hand and his eyes locked onto the shifting patterns of smoke and muzzle flashes below, he begins to calculate the geometry of survival. Drummond isn't just flying, he is dissecting the battlefield. He ignores the tracers reaching up like glowing red fingers to snatch his fragile, unarmored plane from the sky. He focuses on the seam between the American patrol and the North Vietnamese ambushers. In a war defined by overwhelming noise and indiscriminate firepower, Drummond represents a different kind of power, the quiet, calculated heroism of a man who knows that a single degree of error in his calculations could mean the end for the men bleeding in the mud. He banks his plane into a steep, harrowing turn, his thumb resting on the rocket release. The angel from down under has arrived, and the sky is about to answer the prayers of the trapped. To understand the man circling the fires of Vietnam, one must look back to a different war in a different sky. Vance Drummond was not a product of the Vietnam era. He was a seasoned warrior whose character had been forged in the freezing altitudes of the Korean Peninsula over a decade earlier. Born in New Zealand but having found his true home in Australia, Drummond joined the Royal Australian Air Force, RAAF, with a singular passion for flight, a passion that would be tested to its absolute breaking point. In the early 1950s, Drummond served with the legendary No. C7 Squadron RAAF in Korea, piloting the Gloucester Meteor, the RAAF's first jet fighter. It was a time of pioneer jet combat where the margin for error was razor thin. During a high-stakes mission in 1951, Drummond's luck seemingly ran out. Engaging with superior Soviet-built MiG-15s, his aircraft was shot down over enemy territory. He successfully bailed out, only to be captured and plunged into the darkest chapter of his life, 23 months as a prisoner of war, POW, in North Korea. The ordeal of a POW camp is designed to strip a man of his dignity and his hope. Drummond endured brutal interrogations, starvation rations, and the psychological torment of isolation. Yet it was during these 2 years of captivity that his legendary resilience, what his peers would later call his iron core, was solidified. He did not break. Instead, he observed, he survived, and he maintained a quiet defiance that earned the respect of his fellow captives. When he was finally released in 1953 during a prisoner exchange, He returned to Australia not as a broken man, but as a veteran who understood the true value of life and the terrifying weight of being left behind. Most men would have sought a quiet desk job after such trauma, but Drummond's spirit belonged to the air. He fought to stay in the cockpit, proving his skills were sharper than ever. By the time the conflict in Vietnam began to escalate, Drummond had risen to the rank of squadron leader. Because of his immense experience and his reputation for coolness under pressure, he was selected for a prestigious and dangerous assignment, the United States Air Force USAF exchange program. This program was not merely a diplomatic gesture, it was a fusion of elite talent. Drummond was embedded with the USAF's 19th Tactical Air Support Squadron, tasked with mastering the art of the forward air controller. He arrived in Vietnam bringing with him the scars of Korea and the mateship of the RAAF. To the Americans he worked with, he was an enigma, a man who had already faced death and survived, and who now chose to fly a slow, unarmored bird dog back into the line of fire. His background as a POW gave him a unique perspective on the battlefield. He knew exactly what was at stake for the men on the ground. He knew the terror of being surrounded, and he was determined that on his watch, no one else would have to endure the darkness he had once survived. When Vance Drummond was embedded with the United States Air Force, USAF 19th Tactical Air Support Squadron, he stepped into a role that required a rare blend of diplomat, detective, and daredevil. As part of the RAAF USAF exchange program, Drummond wasn't just a guest. He was a vital cog in the American war machine. His primary designation was as a forward air controller, FAC, a role that placed him at the absolute nexus of air and ground operations. While the jet pilots in their Phantoms stayed high and fast, Drummond lived in the low and slow world, flying his unarmored O-1 bird dog just hundreds of feet above the canopy. The integration was seamless, but demanded a high level of professional mastery. Drummond had to master American radio codes, tactical shorthand, and the specific jargon of U.S. infantry units, all while navigating the treacherous, unmarked terrain of the Vietnamese interior. His mission was trifold low-level reconnaissance, target identification, and the life-saving task of marking danger-close strikes for ground units. To do this, he had to fly low enough to draw fire, using his own aircraft as bait to reveal hidden enemy positions. It didn't take long for the American ground troops, the grunts, to notice the distinctive voice coming over their PRC-77 radios. In the middle of a frantic firefight, while American soldiers were screaming for help, Drummond's voice would cut through the static with a calm, measured Australian lilt. He possessed an almost eerie cockpit composure. No matter how many tracers were streaking past his wings, his instructions remained precise and his tone remained level. This professional cool was infectious. It acted as a psychological anchor for the terrified young men pinned down in the mud below. The bond of trust was built sortie by sortie. Drummond earned a reputation for unconventional accuracy. He would circle a contact area for hours, refusing to leave until he was 100% certain of the target's location, ensuring that not a single American life was lost to friendly fire. He became known for his eye for the jungle, the ability to spot a single bent branch or a wisp of cooking smoke that indicated a hidden Viet Cong bunker. Soon, the nickname began to circulate through the mess halls and foxholes. They had an Australian angel watching over them. Drummond's presence was a living bridge between the Anzac spirit and the American military might. He didn't just provide air support, he provided a sense of security. To the American patrols venturing into the green hell, knowing that Squadron Leader Drummond was in the air meant they were never truly alone. He brought a sense of international mateship to the conflict, proving that when the radio crackles and the bullets fly, the only thing that matters is the skill and the soul of the man on the other end of the line. Drummond was no longer just an exchange pilot, he was a guardian of the American infantry. The ultimate test of Vance Drummond's character unfolded during a mission that would push the limits of both man and machine to the breaking point. It began with a frantic mayday from a U.S. Army long-range patrol that had been ambushed in a remote, heavily contested valley. The Americans were caught in a classic L-shaped ambush, pinned against a steep ridge with an overwhelming enemy force closing the distance. As the initial strike aircraft arrived, they found the valley choked with monsoon clouds and a literal wall of anti-aircraft fire. The situation was so dire that commanders were considering the patrol lost. Then Drummond arrived on station. What followed was a marathon of heroism that lasted an incredible 11 hours. In the world of a FAC pilot, time is usually measured by the fuel gauge, but Drummond refused to let a ticking clock dictate the fate of the men below. Over the course of nearly half a day, Drummond remained the singular eye of the storm. As his fuel ran dangerously low, he would perform hot refuels at the nearest primitive dirt strip, landing, gassing up with the engine still running, and leaping back into the sky within minutes. He ignored the exhaustion, the cramped muscles, and the deafening vibration of the bird dog's engine. He had made a silent pact. He would not leave until every American soldier was out. Throughout the ordeal, Drummond faced a relentless barrage of ground fire. The enemy recognized that the small, white Cessna was the brain of the American defense, and they turned every available machine gun toward him. Tracers zipped past his cockpit like angry hornets, and shrapnel from mortar bursts buffeted his light airframe. Yet Drummond never wavered. He flew so low that he could see the muzzle flashes in the undergrowth, dodging and weaving through the rain of fire to place his smoke rockets with surgical precision. His role became that of a master conductor in a symphony of destruction. He coordinated a complex web of assets, heavy F-4 Phantom bombers circling Huey gunships, and dust-off medical evacuation helicopters. Because the jungle was so dense and the friendlies were so close to the enemy, the margin for error was zero. Drummond had to talk the jets onto targets that were often less than 50 meters from the American line. With every pass, he adjusted the coordinates, using his grease pencil on the side window to track the shifting movements of the enemy. By the 11th hour, Drummond's eyes were bloodshot from the strain and the acrid smoke, but his voice on the radio remained the same calm, steady lilt that had become the patrol's only hope. Through his tireless coordination and refusal to retreat, he successfully held back an entire enemy battalion. His precision strikes decimated the ambushers, creating a window of opportunity for the extraction helicopters to swoop in. When the last American soldier was finally winched into a Huey, Drummond was still there, circling like a faithful sentry until the sky was clear. He had spent a day on the edge of death, proving that the greatest weapon in the sky wasn't a bomb. It was the iron will of an Australian who refused to give up on his mates. The heroism of Vance Drummond in the skies over Vietnam was not merely a feat of technical aviation. It was an extraordinary display of human connection that bridged the vast distance between a cockpit and a foxhole. In the terrifying isolation of the jungle, where the trees seemed to bleed fire, and the enemy was often a faceless ghost, the bond between the Australian pilot and the American infantryman became a lifeline. This was a brotherhood of the air and ground, a sacred trust born from the realization that while they occupied different worlds, their lives were inextricably linked by a single radio frequency. For the American soldiers crouched in the mud, bleeding and praying as the North Vietnamese forces closed in, Drummond was more than just a call sign. He was a presence. While they could not see his face, they felt his devotion. In the most desperate moments of contact, when panic threatened to overwhelm the unit, the sound of Drummond's steady, calm Australian accent acted as a psychological shield. There was something about that unhurried, measured lilt that suggested help was not just coming, it was already there. To the grunts below, the fragile silhouette of the bird dog circling through the smoke was a visceral symbol of protection. They began to whisper it among themselves. "We have an Australian angel up there." This connection was fueled by a shared set of values that transcended national borders. The Australian concept of mateship, the idea of unconditional loyalty to one's comrades, found its perfect expression in Drummond's refusal to abandon the Americans under his wing. To Drummond, these weren't just Allied troops, they were his mates. This resonated deeply with the American soldiers, who lived by their own creed of "leave no man behind." Frinin. In the furnace of the Central Highlands, the distinction between the Anzac spirit and the American soldier's grit dissolved. They were all part of the same desperate struggle for survival. The emotional contrast of these missions was vivid and haunting. On the ground, there was the sensory overload of screams, the smell of blood, and the crushing weight of the humidity. Above them, in a solitary cockpit, sat a man in a clean flight suit, seemingly detached from the filth of the earth. yet entirely consumed by the task of preserving the lives within it. Drummond was the guardian who stayed awake so they could survive the night. He was the one who braved the rain of fire, not for a personal score, but because he couldn't bear the thought of a single American patrol being lost on his watch. Even after the missions ended, the stories of the Australian Angel persisted. Veterans would later recount how they looked up through the canopy, saw that tiny, unarmored plane banking through tracers, and felt a surge of hope they hadn't felt in weeks. Drummond had become a legend not because he was a top gun, but because he was a friend. He proved that in the darkest hours of war, the most powerful force isn't the caliber of the weapon, but the depth of the commitment between those who fight. One man, one cockpit, but an entire patrol lived to see another day because they shared a sky with Vance Drummond. When the extraction helicopters finally disappeared over the horizon, carrying the battered but living remains of the American patrol, a profound silence returned to the valley, save for the fading hum of Vance Drummond's engine. The mission was a resounding success. Against all odds, the patrol had been pulled from the jaws of a well-orchestrated ambush with minimal casualties. On the ground, as the soldiers reached the safety of their base, the first thing many did was ask about the pilot of the Bird Dog. They knew that without that specific eye in the sky, their names would have surely been added to the growing list of the fallen. The aftermath of the 11-hour ordeal saw a flurry of activity within the American command structure. The U.S. Army officers who had witnessed the engagement from the ground and the tactical operations centers were nothing short of astonished. They began drafting reports that were uncharacteristically emotional for military bureaucracy. They described a level of superlative airmanship and conspicuous gallantry that they had rarely seen, even among their own elite units. It wasn't just that Drummond had done his job, it was the way he had done it, the total disregard for his own safety, and the agonizingly long duration he remained under fire. Based on these glowing eyewitness accounts, the United States military took the exceptional step of recommending Squadron Leader Vance Drummond for the Distinguished Flying Cross, DFC. The DFC is one of the highest honors for aerial heroism, and for it to be recommended for a foreign officer by the U.S. Air Force was a moment of immense historical significance. It was a formal acknowledgement that Drummond's actions had transcended the usual boundaries of an exchange program. To the Americans, he was no longer a foreign advisor, he was a hero of their own making. The recommendation specifically cited his extraordinary achievement and his tireless devotion to duty. The reports highlighted the fact that Drummond had repeatedly flown into the dead zone of enemy anti-aircraft fire to mark targets with pinpoint accuracy, often at altitudes so low that his aircraft was a target for even the most basic infantry weapons. The American commanders noted that his coolness under pressure and accurate direction were the direct causes for the successful suppression of the enemy and the safe recovery of the patrol. Decades later, anecdotes from the American veterans who were there still echo this sentiment. One veteran recalled, "We were waiting for the end, and then this voice with an Aussie accent comes on and tells us to hang tight, that he wasn't going anywhere." And he didn't. He stayed until the last man was winched up. This rare recommendation for the DFC served as a permanent record of a debt that could never truly be repaid in medals alone. It was the highest form of thank you from one nation to a single man from another. A recognition that on that day, in that jungle, Vance Drummond had been the difference between life and death. The heroism Vance Drummond displayed during that fateful 11-hour rescue was not a singular peak, but rather a reflection of the consistent, relentless bravery he brought to every sortie in Vietnam. Following the successful extraction of the American patrol, Drummond continued to serve with the USAF's 19th Tactical Air Support Squadron, completing his tour with a reputation as one of the most respected forward air controllers in the theater. By the time he prepared to leave Vietnam, he had flown hundreds of combat missions, survived countless brushes with death, and solidified a legacy of mateship that would be whispered in RAAF and USAF mess halls for years to come. Upon his return to Australia, Drummond was hailed as a national hero within the military community. His experiences as a prisoner of war in Korea, combined with his decorated service in Vietnam, made him a vital asset for the RAAF's future. He was promoted to wing commander and given the prestigious command of No. 75 Squadron, based at RAAF Base Williamtown. This was a significant transition. He moved from the slow, unarmored bird dog to the cutting edge of aviation technology. The Dassault Mirage III, a supersonic delta-wing fighter jet. Drummond was tasked with leading Australia's premier fighter squadron, preparing a new generation of pilots for the complexities of modern air combat. However, the sky, which had been his sanctuary, his battlefield, and his home for 2 decades, finally claimed him in a tragic twist of fate. On May 17, 1967, during a routine but demanding high-altitude training exercise off the coast of New South Wales, Drummond's Mirage entered a catastrophic flat spin. This particular aerodynamic condition was notoriously difficult to recover from in the early delta-wing jets. Despite his immense skill and his history of surviving the impossible, the aircraft plummeted toward the sea. Wing Commander Vance Drummond made his final descent into the Pacific Ocean. He was only 39 years old. The news sent shockwaves through both the Australian and American military establishments. The man who had survived the frozen brutality of a North Korean POW camp in the rain of fire in the Vietnamese jungle had been taken by a mechanical failure during a time of peace. It was a staggering loss. The RAAF had lost one of its most capable leaders, and the USAF had lost a brother who had become a legend in their own ranks. His death was felt deeply on both sides of the Pacific. To the Australians, he was the quintessential digger of the air, a man of quiet grit and unyielding loyalty. To the Americans, he was the Australian angel who had stayed on station when the world was burning. Drummond had lived a life defined by the roar of engines and the silent weight of responsibility. He had dedicated every waking hour to the safety of others, and though he perished in the waves of his homeland, his spirit remained etched in the clouds over the Central Highlands. He had lived and died on his own terms, a warrior of the eternal sky whose final flight marked the end of an era, but the beginning of an immortal legend. In the decades that have passed since Wing Commander Vance Drummond's final flight, his name has drifted into a quiet corner of history, a forgotten hero in his own homeland. Today, if you walk the streets of Sydney or Melbourne, few would recognize the name of the man who cheated death in Korea and became a guardian angel in Vietnam. There are no grand cinematic epics dedicated to his life, no towering bronze statues in the city squares, and his story is rarely found in school textbooks. In the national consciousness of Australia, Drummond remains a silent sentinel, his bravery overshadowed by the larger, more controversial narratives of the Vietnam era. Yet if you look across the Pacific to the memories of American veterans, the legacy of the Australian Angel is vibrant and indestructible. To the men of the U.S. Army patrols who were pulled from the brink of annihilation, Vance Drummond is a name spoken with a reverence that time cannot erode. For them, he is not a footnote in a history book. He is the reason they were able to return home, marry, and see their children grow. The American recognition of his valor, the rare recommendation for the Distinguished Flying Cross, stands as a permanent record of a debt that transcends borders. In the United States, his story is a testament to the idea that the strongest bonds are not those signed in ink, but those forged in the shared blood of the battlefield. Reflecting on Drummond's life reveals a deeper truth about the relationship between Australia and the United States. The joint operations in Vietnam, characterized by the selfless integration of men like Drummond into the USAF, built a foundation of trust that remains the gold standard for international alliances today. When RAAF and USF pilots fly together in modern conflicts, they are operating within a framework of mutual respect that was cemented by a bird dog circling a smoking jungle for 11 hours. Drummond proved that mateship is a universal language. It doesn't matter if the accent is from the Outback or the Midwest when the goal is to bring everyone home alive. We must remember Vance Drummond not just for his medals, but for his humanity. He was a man who understood the profound darkness of captivity and used that experience to fuel a limitless devotion to others. He represents a generation of Anzac warriors who served with a quiet, professional dignity, seeking neither fame nor fortune, but simply the satisfaction of a mission accomplished. His legacy is a reminder that even in the most noisy and chaotic of wars, heroism often wears a quiet face and speaks with a steady, reassuring voice. As we conclude this tribute, let us look back at the image of a single, fragile plane hovering over a sea of fire. One man, one cockpit, and an entire patrol that lived because he refused to blink. Vance Drummond may be a forgotten hero to some, but to those he saved, he is the eternal guardian of the sky. His story is a call to remember all those who served in the shadows, proving that true courage is the light that never goes out, even when the world is on fire.